Have you ever wondered what really happens after the wedding rings go on and the cameras finally look away? Everyone remembers the kiss. Everyone remembers the headlines. But almost no one remembers what came after, in the quiet rooms where two of the most watched people on the planet tried to build anything real. Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley didn't fall apart because of a scandal the tabloids invented. They didn't fall apart because of one dramatic betrayal. They fell apart because of something far more human, something hidden underneath all the flashbulbs and the speculation. This is the story of the hidden reason Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley couldn't stay together, and why understanding it changes the way we see their entire marriage. To understand what pulled them apart, you first have to understand what pulled them together. Michael Jackson had not lived a single day of his life outside of public view. From the moment he stepped onto a stage as a child, he belonged to the world in a way most people can barely imagine. Every choice he made was studied. Every silence was interpreted. By the time he was an adult, he had spent more years being famous than he had spent being anything else. Lisa Marie Presley knew a version of that life too, though hers began the moment she was born. She arrived into a family that already belonged to history. Her father was not simply a singer to millions of people. He was a symbol, an icon, a man whose every movement had once stopped traffic in cities he never even visited. When she lost him as a child, she didn't just lose a parent. She lost him in front of the entire world, with grief that had nowhere private to go. Long before the wedding, long before the world had any idea a romance was forming, Michael and Lisa Marie had crossed paths as young people navigating similar circles of famous families and industry gatherings. Those early encounters were brief, almost forgettable to outsiders, the kind of passing hello two acquaintances share at an event neither will remember, years later. But something about those early meetings must have lingered, because when their paths crossed again as adults, the recognition between them felt immediate rather than new. It is one thing to meet a stranger and slowly build trust over months or years. It is another thing entirely to meet someone and feel, almost instantly, that they already understand a part of your life no one else has ever fully grasped. That is closer to what happened between them. That shared inheritance, the strange experience of being known by strangers everywhere on Earth, became the foundation of their connection. When they began spending real time together in the early 90s, Michael was under a level of scrutiny that would have broken most people. His name filled headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with high. His music. Reporters camped outside his properties. Old friends sold stories. Michael later described feeling like very few people in his life wanted to know him rather than simply wanting something from him. Lisa Marie offered something different. She had grown up around fame her entire life, so she wasn't dazzled by his. She had watched her own mother navigate a very public life after loss, so she understood the exhaustion that comes from never truly being alone. For Michael, that understanding felt like oxygen. For Lisa Marie, Michael offered something she had rarely found either. Most people who entered her life either treated her as an extension of her father's legacy or tried to get closer to that legacy through her. Michael didn't need anything from the Presley name. He had built his own empire from nothing but talent and relentless work. He saw her, not the surname attached to her. In long conversations, they discovered they could speak a language almost no one else shared. The language of growing up inside a myth that other people had written about them before they were ever old enough to write it themselves. Then, in 1994, the world found out. The announcement of their marriage detonated across every form of media that existed at the time. Newspapers ran multiple editions in a single day just to keep up with the public reaction. Talk shows built entire episodes around the question of whether the marriage was real. Comedians built careers on jokes about it. Almost nobody treated it as simply two adults choosing to build a life together. Instead, it became a puzzle the entire planet felt entitled to solve. Was it love? Was it strategy? Was it rebellion? Was it grief finding an unexpected shape? The noise never stopped, and it never once considered that the two people at the center of it were still trying to figure that out themselves. Consider what it actually meant to be them in that moment. Most newlyweds get to spend their first months learning each other's habits in private, arguing about small things, laughing about smaller things, figuring out how two lives fit together without an audience. Michael and Lisa Marie never got that luxury. Their honeymoon period unfolded with photographers stationed outside hotels, with strangers chasing cars down public streets, with commentators debating the sincerity of their vows on the eve. Ning news. Imagine trying to decide, together, where you actually want to live while millions of strangers are simultaneously deciding for you what your marriage means. That is not an environment built for intimacy. That is an environment built for exhaustion. Almost immediately, their marriage stopped functioning like a marriage and started functioning like a performance the world refused to let them step out of. Every public appearance turned into evidence for one theory or another. If they smiled, people said it was staged. If they seemed tense, people said the marriage was already failing. If they showed affection in public, headlines speculated about what it meant. If they didn't, headlines speculated about that too. There was no version of behavior that satisfied the endless appetite for a story. Somewhere in the middle of that noise, they were also two individuals negotiating something incredibly ordinary and incredibly difficult: how to actually live with another person day to day. This is where the hidden reason begins to take shape, and it has almost nothing to do with scandal. Michael Jackson, by the time he married Lisa Marie, had spent decades building walls around himself as a form of survival. Those walls had kept him safe from exploitation, but they had also kept nearly everyone at arm's length, including people who genuinely loved him. He needed someone who could be inside those walls with him completely, someone who would choose him privately in a way the public version of his life had never allowed. Lisa Marie wanted to be that person. She said as much in later interviews, describing genuine tenderness and care in their relationship. But being that person for Michael required something enormous. It required setting aside pieces of her own identity, her own independence, her own need to be seen as herself rather than as his protector or as proof to the world that he could be loved. Lisa Marie was not someone built to disappear into another person's story. She had spent her entire life fighting to be seen as more than her father's daughter. She had pursued her own music. She had built her own opinions, her own instincts, her own sense of who she was outside of any famous name attached to her. Marrying Michael meant stepping into her enormous shadow, one that came with its own separate mythology, its own separate army of assumptions. Even as she tried to support him, part of her was quietly fighting the same battle she had fought her whole life, the battle to remain her own person inside a story bigger than herself. That tension rarely showed up as dramatic arguments captured by paparazzi. It showed up in smaller, quieter ways. It showed up in scheduling conflicts between his relentless creative obligations and her desire for a stable home life. It showed up in the different rhythms of their days, his often built around late-night studio seances and international travel, hers shaped by a longing for routine and normalcy after years of chaos following her father's death. It showed up in the different ways they processed trust. Michael had learned, through painful experience, to question the motives of almost everyone who entered his orbit. Lisa Marie wanted an equal partnership, built on openness rather than careful management. Two people can care for each other deeply and still find that their deepest needs pull in opposite directions. That is not scandal. That is simply the quiet mathematics of two complicated lives trying to fit together. To understand why Michael needed so much reassurance, you have to look back further than the marriage itself, back to a childhood spent almost entirely on stages and in recording studios rather than classrooms and playgrounds. He rehearsed for hours as a boy while other children his age were still learning to ride bicycles. He could pee or formed in front of adult audiences before he had finished growing into his own body. By the time he was old enough to understand what was happening to him, he had already lost the ordinary markers most people use to build a sense of identity separate from their work. Add to that errands, his choices, and his private life, and you begin to see why trust became one of the most difficult things for him to offer freely, even to someone he loved. He had learned through repeated experience that closeness often came with a price attached, whether it was a magazine deal, a lawsuit, or betrayal dressed up as friendship. Lisa Marie's guardedness came from a different direction, but arrived at a similar destination. She had watched adults around her treat her father's memory as a commodity for years after his death. She had grown up hearing herself described in headlines before she had a chance to describe herself in her own words. When she eventually became a mother herself, she carried the added weight of trying to give her children something she had never fully had, a childhood shielded from the machinery of fame. Two people, who had each learned to protect themselves from a world that constantly wanted a piece of them, were now trying to lower those same protections for each other. That is one of the hardest things two people can attempt together, and it rarely happens on the timeline either person hopes for. Michael's world required constant motion. Albums did not finish themselves. Tours did not book themselves. Business empires the size of his did not run without his direct involvement in decisions large and small, even when he wanted Rios. Saint, the machinery around him, rarely allowed it. Lisa Marie, on the other hand, increasingly wanted a life that felt smaller, steadier, closer to normal, even if normal was always going to be relative for someone with her last name. She wanted evenings that weren't interrupted by emergencies. She wanted a partner who could be physically and emotionally present, not just in spirit, but in the ordinary hours that make up most of a marriage. The very thing that made Michael who he was, his complete devotion to his art and his career, was also the thing that made it nearly impossible for him to give her what she needed most. There is another layer to the hidden reason, one that rarely gets discussed honestly. Michael Jackson had endured trauma that reshaped how he understood safety itself. Years of relentless media attention, combined with deeply painful chapters from his childhood, had left him guarded in ways that even people close to him struggled to fully reach. Lisa Marie later spoke about witnessing the emotional toll that a lifetime of extraordinary scrutiny had taken on him. She described someone who carried enormous pain quietly, someone whose public confidence often masked private exhaustion. Ill. Holding someone who carries that kind of weight is not simple. It requires patience that can be difficult to sustain, especially when your own life is also under a magnifying glass, especially when you also carry grief of your own that the world rarely allowed you to process privately. Meanwhile, Lisa Marie was managing her own history of loss and public expectation. Losing her father as a child had shaped nearly every relationship she would ever have. Some who knew her described a lifelong search for connection that felt safe and unconditional, something increasingly difficult to find when nearly everyone she met already had an opinion about who she was supposed to be. When she and Michael found each other, it must have felt like two people who had each spent their lives being misunderstood Fina, yet a lie being understood. But understanding someone's pain and being able to heal it are two very different things. Two people can recognize each other's wounds perfectly and still be unable to bandage them for one another. Sometimes recognition creates closeness. Sometimes it simply creates two people standing very close together while each remains alone in their own unresolved history. As 1995 continued, cracks that had started as small disagreements slowly widened into distance. Friends close to the couple described growing frustration on both sides, not because either person had stopped caring, but because the daily reality of the marriage kept colliding with the fantasy the public had built around it. Michael wanted the world to see Prue, relationship despite everything he had been through. Lisa Marie wanted a relationship that didn't require constant performance, constant explanation, constant defense against outside judgment. The very thing Michael needed the marriage to prove was, in some ways, the exact pressure that made the marriage harder to sustain. There were moments of genuine tenderness that rarely made headlines. People who spent time around them described quiet, ordinary affection, inside jokes, long conversations late into the night, moments that looked nothing like the tabloid version of their relationship. Those moments were real. The warmth between them was real. But warmth alone cannot dissolve fundamentally different visions of what daily life should look like. Warmth alone cannot erase the exhaustion of being permanently public. Warmth alone cannot resolve two people's different definitions of what safety and partnership actually mean. It's worth pausing here to ask why the public reacted the way it did in the first place. The 1990s were a unique moment in celebrity culture. Tabloid magazines were reaching the height of their influence, competing fiercely for newsstand sales with increasingly dramatic covers. Television gossip shows had multiplied, filling entire programming blocks with speculation about T-celebrity relationships. There was no social media yet to spread rumors instantly, but there didn't need to be. Print media and television alone were powerful enough to shape public opinion within days. Michael and Lisa Marie's marriage arrived at exactly the moment when the Mac spectacle was operating at full capacity, with an appetite that seemed to grow larger the more it was fed. That environment did something subtle but damaging. It trained millions of people to treat two real human beings as characters in an ongoing drama are, other than as an actual married couple navigating actual struggles. Every small gesture became a clue to be decoded. Every public silence became suspicious. The relationship was rarely allowed to simply exist. It was constantly being interpreted, dissected, and turned into content for entertainment. Living inside that kind of relentless narrative construction would strain any relationship, no matter how strong the underlying connection. It becomes almost impossible to know which parts of your own